I'm Laureli Shimayo, and tonight I run a panel about spiritual bypassing. It's at 4 p.m. Pacific time. It's Saturday, January 16. And I want to share a little bit about some about spiritual bypassing from one of my teachers. It's Robert Augustus Masters. He has this book, Spiritual Bypassing, When Spirituality Disconnects Us from What Really Matters. So I studied with Robert, like around 10 years ago. And I actually edited this book with my old name. And I'd like to read the introduction. It's a way of getting me ready for the panel tonight. And also, I just like to share with you so you get more of an idea of what spiritual bypassing is. This is his perspective and a lot of my perspective. And I'm curious to see how my perspective on it maybe has shifted or changed or expanded since then. And yeah, just give you some context. So I'm going to read his introduction. Again, this is from Robert Masters, and I'll put a link to his website and a link to the book in the post. So the introduction, Avoidance in Holy Drag, an introduction to spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing, a term first coined by psychologist John Wellwood in 1984, is the use of spiritual practices and beliefs to avoid dealing with our painful feelings, unresolved wounds, and developmental needs. It is much more common than we might think, and in fact, so pervasive as to go largely unnoticed, except in its more obvious extremes. Part of the reason for this is that we tend to not have very much tolerance, either personally or collectively, for facing, entering, and working through our pain, strongly preferring pain-numbing solutions, regardless of how much suffering such remedies may catalyze. Because this preference has so deeply and thoroughly infiltrated our culture, it has become all but normalized, and spiritual bypassing fits almost seamlessly into our collective habit of turning away from what is painful as a kind of higher analgesic with seemingly minimal side effects. It is a spiritualized strategy, not only for avoiding pain, but also for legitimizing such avoidance in ways ranging from the blatantly obvious to the extremely subtle. Spiritual bypassing is a very persistent shadow of spirituality, manifesting in many forms, often without being acknowledged as such. Aspects of spiritual bypassing include exaggerated detachment, emotional numbing and repression, overemphasis on the positive, anger phobia, blind or overly tolerant compassion, weak or too porous boundaries, lopsided development, such as cognitive intelligence being far ahead of emotional and moral intelligence. I certainly know that one. Debilitating judgment about one's negativity or shadow side, right? So being so hard on oneself. Devaluation of the personal relative to the spiritual, and delusions of having arrived at a higher level of being. The explosion of interest in spirituality since the mid-1960s, especially Eastern spirituality, has been accompanied by a corresponding interest and immersion in spiritual bypassing, which has, however, not very often been named, let alone viewed as such. It has been easier to frame spiritual bypassing as a religion transcending, spiritually advanced practice or perspective, especially in the fast food spirituality epitomized by faddish phenomena like The Secret. Some of the more glaring, facile features, such as drive-through servings of reheated wisdom like, don't take it personally, or whatever bothers you about someone is really only about you, or it's all just an illusion, are available for consumption and parroting by just about anyone. Happily, the honeymoon with false or superficial notions of spirituality is starting to wane. Enough bubbles have been burst, enough spiritual teachers, Eastern and Western, have been caught with pants or halo down. Enough cults have come and gone. Enough time has been spent with spiritual baubles, credentials, energy transmissions that are false, and guru centrism to sense deeper treasures. But valuable as the desire for a more authentic spirituality is, such change will not occur on any significant scale and really take root until spiritual bypassing is outgrown. And that is not as easy as it might sound, for it asks that we cease turning away from our pain, numbing ourselves, and expecting spirituality to make us feel better. I'm going to add my comments in here. So I don't think that change can't occur until spiritual bypassing is outgrown. I do think that it is like layers of an onion. It's something that we need to continue to look at, to see new ways that we might be bypassing. so that what's true, so that facing what's here and what's true can emerge. True spirituality is not a high, not a rush, not an altered state. It has been fine to romance it for a while, but our times call for something far more real, grounded, and responsible. Something radically alive and naturally integral. Something that shakes us to our very core until we stop treating spiritual deepening as something to dabble in here and there. Authentic spirituality is not some little flicker or buzz of knowingness, not a psychedelic blast through, or a mellow hanging out on some exalted plane of consciousness. Not a bubble of immunity, but a vast fire of liberation, an exquisitely fitting crucible and sanctuary, providing both heat and light for the healing and awakening we need. Most of the time, when we're immersed in spiritual bypassing, we like the light, but not the heat. And when we're caught up in the grosser forms of spiritual bypassing, we'd usually much rather theorize about the frontiers of consciousness than actually go there, suppressing the fire rather than breathing it even more alive, espousing the ideal of unconditional love, but not permitting love to show up in its more challenging, personal dimensions. To do so would be too hot, too scary, too out of control, bringing things to the surface that we have long disowned or suppressed. But if we really want the light, we cannot afford to flee the heat. As Viktor Frankl said, what gives light must endure burning. And being with the fire's heat doesn't just mean sitting with the difficult stuff in meditation, but also going into it, trekking to its core, facing and entering and getting intimate with whatever is there, however scary or traumatic or sad or raw. I'm going to point to that if it's traumatic. Going with care, going at a pace that one can actually be with, getting support. All those things are important. We've had quite an affair with Eastern spiritual pathways, but now it is time to go deeper. I don't know that all Eastern spiritual pathways are bad, but we must do this not only to get more intimate with the essence of these wisdom traditions beyond ritual and belief and dogma, but also to make room for the healthy evolution, not just the necessary westernization of these traditions, so that their presentation ceases encouraging spiritual bypassing, however indirectly, and in fact, consciously and actively ceases giving it soil to flower. Yeah, I can totally see that the westernization of things has been a bit of bypassing. Just a bit. These changes won't happen to any significant degree, however, unless we work in depth and integratively with our physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, and social dimensions to generate an ever-deepening sense of wholeness, vitality, and basic sanity. Any spiritual path, Eastern or Western, that does not deal in real depth with psychological issues and deal with these in more than just spiritual contexts is setting itself up for an abundance of spiritual bypassing. If there's not sufficient encouragement and support from spiritual teachers and teachings for practitioners to engage in significant depth in psycho-emotional work, and if those students who really need such work then don't do it, they'll be left trying to work out their psycho-emotional issues, traumatic and otherwise, only through the spiritual practices they have been given, as if doing so is somehow superior to or a higher activity than engaging in quality psychotherapy. I think good coaching fits in here too. Psychotherapy is often viewed as an inferior undertaking relative to spiritual practice, perhaps even something we shouldn't have to do. When our spiritual bypassing is more subtle, the idea of psychotherapy may be considered more acceptable, but we will still shy away from a full-blooded investigation of our core wounds. I know I recently took Lisa Rankin's brief course on what's beyond spiritual bypassing, and had a I don't remember what word she called it, but it was like to offload or off-road, or how to step away from spiritual bypassing. And one of the tools that she uses is IFS, internal family systems. It's letting the voices inside us that come from wounding have a chance to speak, and doing so at a pace that we're actually able to be with them and feel them, and have a somatic experience of it through our body in a way that allows us to be facing and integrating it in a pacing at which we can be with. That's my description of it. Spiritual bypassing is largely occupied, at least in its New Age forms, by the idea of wholeness and the innate unity of being, oneness, being perhaps its favorite bumper sticker, but actually generates and reinforces fragmentation by separating out from and ejecting what is painful, distressed, and unhealed. All the far from flattering aspects of being human. It's tricky, right? Non-duality, how to be in the experience of it and not use it as a bypass. By consistently keeping these in the dark, down below, where we're locked into our headquarters, our body and feelings seem to be below us. They tend to behave badly when left out, much like animals that have spent too long in cages. So that's our body and our feelings acting out. Our neglect of these aspects of ourselves, however gently framed, is akin to that of otherwise caring parents who leave their children without sufficient food, clothing, or care. The trappings of spiritual bypassing can look good, particularly when they seem to promise freedom from one's life's fuss and fury, but the supposed serenity and detachment is often little more than metaphysical Valium, especially for those who have made too much of a virtue out of being and looking positive. A common telltale sign of spiritual bypassing is a lack of grounding and in-the-body experience that tends to keep us either spacily afloat in how we relate to the world or too rigidly tethered to a spiritual system that seemingly provides the solidity we lack. We also may fall into premature forgiveness and emotional dissociation and confuse anger with aggression and ill will, which leaves us disempowered, riddled with weak boundaries. Those of you who have taken my courses know how I distinguish between anger and fear or aggression, fear, fight, or aggression. I think that it's so important that we connect with our anger, our yes, no. It's a knowing that we are worthy, to me, is what is underneath there, before we go to forgiveness. And that's exactly what this is addressing here. I think it's a bypass if we go to forgiveness too early. The overdone niceness that often characterizes spiritual bypassing strands it from emotional depth and authenticity, and its underlying grief, mostly spoken, untouched, unacknowledged, keeps it marooned from the very caring that would unwrap and undo it, like a baby being readied for a bath by a loving parent. Spiritual bypassing distances us not only from our pain and difficult personal issues, but also from our own authentic spirituality, stranding us in a metaphysical limbo, a zone of exaggerated gentleness, niceness, and superficiality. Its frequently disconnected nature keeps it adrift, clinging to the life jacket of its self-conferred spiritual credentials. As such, it maroons us from embodying our full humanity. But let us not be too hard on spiritual bypassing, for every one of us who has entered into the spiritual has engaged in spiritual bypassing. We all do it, at least to some degree, having for years used other means to make ourselves feel better or more secure. Why would we not also approach spirituality, particularly at first, with much the same expectation that it make us feel better or more secure in various areas of our life? To truly outgrow spiritual bypassing, which in part means releasing spirituality and everything else from the obligation to make us feel better or more secure or more whole, we must not only see it for what it is and cease engaging in it, but also view it with genuine compassion, however fiery that might be or need to be. The spiritual bypasser in us needs not censure, nor shame, nor shaming, but rather to be consciously and caringly included in our awareness without being allowed to run the show. Becoming intimate with our own capacity for spiritual bypassing allows us to keep it in healthy perspective. Looking for it, being aware of where it might be here, being willing to peel it away and be with what's underneath, and not doing it compulsively at the same time. Those are my words. I have worked with many clients, this is Robert Augustus Masters again. I've worked with many clients who describe themselves as being on a spiritual path, particularly as mediators. No, never mind, meditators. I've worked with many clients who describe themselves as being on a spiritual path, particularly as meditators. Most were preoccupied, at least initially, with being nice, trying to be positive and non-judgmental, while impaling themselves on various spiritual shoulds, such as, I should not show anger, or I should be more loving, or I should be more open after all the time I put into my spiritual practice. Fleeing their darker, or less spiritual, emotions, impulses, and intentions, they had to varying degrees trap themselves within the very practices and beliefs that they had hoped might liberate them, or at least make them feel better. Right, so many of the spiritual practices that we hope will provide relief, maybe provide growth. If we don't do a facing with what's here, facing into what's here at the same time, they cover things over and actually keep the things trapped that will actually liberate us. Even the most exquisitely designed spiritual methodologies can become traps, leading not to freedom, but only to reinforcement, however subtle, of the I that wants to be a somebody who has attained or realized freedom, the very same I that doesn't realize there are no Oscars for awakening. The most obvious potential traps in waiting include the belief that we should rise above our difficulties and simply embrace oneness, even as the tendency to divide everything into positive and negative, higher and lower, spiritual and non-spiritual, runs wild in us. Subtler traps in waiting, less densely populated with metaphysical lullabies and ascension metaphors, and cloaked in the appearance of discernment, teach non-aversion through cultivating a capacity for dispassionate witnessing under various devotional rituals. Okay, I gotta look at that one again. The most obvious potential traps in waiting include the belief that we should rise above our difficulties and simply embrace oneness, even as the tendency to divide everything into positive and negative, higher and lower, spiritual and non-spiritual runs wild in us. Subtler traps in waiting, less densely populated with metaphysical lullabies and ascension metaphors, and cloaked in the appearance of discernment, teach non-aversion through cultivating a capacity for dispassionate witnessing under various devotional rituals. So it sounds like the subtle things are just lullabies, essentially, that put us to sleep, or ascension metaphors that seem to lift us up. They're cloaked in what appears to be discernment, and they teach to not avert, to instead be dispassionate, to be neutral, and to witness. It says various devotional rituals. Maybe so. Devotional, I could say, is like putting something higher than, and it's pushing ourselves down at the same time. Let's see where he goes. Subtler still are those that emphasize meeting everything with acceptance and compassion. Each approach has its own value, if only to eventually propel us into an even deeper direction, and each is far from immune to being possessed by spiritual bypassing, especially when we are still hoping, whatever our depth of spiritual practice, to reach a state of immunity to suffering, both personally and collectively. So it's that grasping, right, for immunity from suffering. The line in here also makes me think about authentic relating and the lines that are sometimes used of accept everything and tolerate nothing. So the accept everything on its own is a form of spiritual bypassing, and the tolerate nothing adds such an interesting element. It's adding to not be with what you don't want, what's not good, what tolerate, right? What are we forcing on our systems that our systems don't want? Knowing that divine, knowing that universe is within. How do we not allow that to flow? How do we hold that back? So I love that authentic relating is that dance of broadening acceptance and also discernment, I'll use that word, to really just allowing impulses to flow about not tolerating. Yeah, and authentic relating has its own dance with this too. We don't have infinite time, infinite resources. What do we choose? As my spirituality inclined clients to become more intimate with their pain and difficulties, coming to understand the origins of their troubles with a more open ear and heart, they either abandon their misguided spiritual practices and re-enter a more fitting version of themselves with less submissiveness and more integrity and creativity, or find new practices that better suit their needs. Coming to recognize more deeply that everything can serve their healing and awakening. My purpose in writing this book is to present not just an anatomy of spiritual bypassing and its many faces, but also to invite the outgrowing of it, so that we might enter a deeper life, a life of full-blooded integrity, depth, love, and sanity, a life of authenticity on every level, a life in which the personal, interpersonal, and transpersonal are all honored and lived to the fullest. May what I have written serve you well. So again, that's Robert Masters, Spiritual Bypassing, When Spirituality Disconnects Us from What Really Matters. And I'm going to read to you the table of contents. So we just read Avoidance and Holy Drag, an introduction to spiritual bypassing. And the next chapters are Cutting Through Spiritual Bypassing, Let's Stop Being Negative About Our Negativity, Blind Compassion, Neurotic Tolerance in Caring's Robes, Healthy and Unhealthy Transcendence, Cutting Through Spiritual Shortcuts, Bringing Shadows Work Out of the Shadows, What Generates Spiritual Bypassing, The Anatomy of Magical Thinking, Why Don't More Spiritual Teachers Include Psychotherapy in Their Work, Making Wise Use of Anger, Boundaries Make Freedom Possible, Don't Take It Personally, Releasing Sex from the Obligation to Make Us Feel Better, Neither Romancing Nor Fleeing Relationship, Disembodied Spirituality and Embodied Being, True Responsibility, Heart, Guts, Accountability, Spiritual Gullibility and Cultism, Are We Responsible for Our Illness? When Non-Dual Teachings Are Non-Dual, Bringing Shame Out of the Shadows, When Our Honeymoon with Spirituality is Over. And I want to go look for a moment at, are we responsible for our illness? Because this is a way that spirituality is often used to create lots of harm for other people, trauma. We could do it to ourselves too. Are we responsible for our illness? This is chapter 19. There's plenty packed into this question, and so the answer requires more than a simple yes or no. There are many people who believe that we are responsible, fully responsible for our illness, regardless of other contributing factors. Not surprisingly, many of those who adhere to such a belief are firm believers in the notion that we create our own reality, particularly through our thoughts. For them, illness is not considered the result of a kind of thought disorder, with negative thinking. For them, illness is considered the result of a kind of thought disorder, with negative thinking being the primary culprit. The exaggerated optimism of this kind of belief in positive thinking tends to run roughshod over any dissenting, read negative, opinions. While the concept of positive thinking predates the New Age movement, it has been increasingly usurped by and abused in spiritual bypassing circles to the point that a judgmental, uncompassionate, pick yourself up by your own bootstraps mentality has become widespread and is applied to one and all. For example, a way that's used in racism, if people are accused of not taking action enough to move themselves forward, it denies that racism is systemic, that there is so much privilege to so many, white privilege. Including with terminal illness. Let's go back and I'll give you more of that whole sentence. Robert writes such long sentences. While the concept of positive thinking predates the New Age movement, it has been increasingly usurped by and abused in spiritual bypassing circles to the point that a judgmental, uncompassionate, pick yourself up by your own bootstraps mentality has become widespread and is applied to one and all, including those with terminal illness. The idea that we create our own reality and can control every aspect of our lives if only we will it strongly enough has become popularized through much of New Age spirituality, especially through the prosperity consciousness gospel and the laws of attraction peddled in books like The Secret. The shadow elements of these sunny side up, you can have it all concepts should not be underestimated. They have spawned such beliefs as the notion that we are completely responsible for our illness or for anything else that happens to us, simply because we and we alone have created it. Thus it is our fault if we have cancer or any other disease. To hold anything else responsible from environmental factors to genetics is simply delusion. If we want to be well and totally believe that we will get well, then we will of course get well. And if we don't get well, it must be because we didn't really want to get well. After all, we create our reality, don't we? If we are sick, it must be because we have chosen it for ourselves. Those who adhere to such a belief system leave themselves very little room in which to maneuver when they find out that they have a serious illness. They believe that they have brought it into being, that they and they alone are responsible for it. This generates powerful conditions for the arising of guilt. If I now have cancer, then I must have done something wrong. Otherwise, I wouldn't have cancer. Adherence to this New Age dogma means that rather than fully exploring the nature of our illness, we may be further debilitated by guilt for having supposedly creating something as life negating and unspiritual as cancer. The belief that we literally create our reality often carries a certain grandiosity, uncritically attributing inordinate or impossible power to our capacity for wishing and wanting and imagining, as described in the Magical Thinking chapter. Such me-centered overestimations of personal power are quite natural to young children, but not to adults. Those spiritual practitioners who are caught up in this belief, perhaps influenced by what they have heard from high-profile teachers of New Age spirituality, may feel inflated by the idea that they alone create their reality, but inevitably must become flattened by it, given how far short of their goals they find themselves. Unfortunately, falling short of one's goals is rarely used as an opportunity to critically examine these beliefs about reality creation, but instead become an occasion to shame oneself for having failed. And he goes on, and I just realized I have someone I need to send this to. Let's go check out the Magical Thinking chapter briefly. So this is chapter, I've got to go in a moment, but chapter 9. Spiritual bypassing can be quite intellectually sophisticated, but sometimes, especially in its New Age forms, it finds expression through a far more simplistic form of cognition known as magical thinking. Seeing causality and coincidence, giving unwarranted weight to coincidence, is central to magical thinking. Oh, this is also tricky. It's like such a slippery slope, right? So he does spirituality, but he does not do so much of metaphysics. And when is it magical thinking? When are we making up a pattern? And when is there really a pattern? When is the universe really talking to us? When is the universe here? And when are we allowing ourselves to see it? Very tricky, slippery slope. Seeing causality and coincidence, giving unwarranted weight to coincidence, is central to magical thinking. Say we're driving along in a hurry and demand that the light up ahead turn green right away, and at that very moment the light turns green. Even though we know better, we connect our demand with the light turning green, sensing the juxtaposition of these two seemingly unrelated events as more than just a coincidence. This is magical thinking. We all have such moments, but sometimes these beliefs take deeper root, as in the proliferating New Age dogma that we have the capacity to radically alter our world through the power of thought. We do have some power. It's how much do we assign this, and what do we avoid by seeing things this way? Oh my. Okay, I'm not going to go down this route, but let me see if there are any specific things in here that are good. None of this is to say that there is anything inherently wrong with magical thinking. It is not essential not only to our childhood and our early evolution as it is essential not only to our childhood and our early evolution as a species, but also to our imaginative and dreamtime faculties. But when we treat magical thinking as a literal rather than a metaphoric realm, we put ourselves in a difficult position, trying to fit reality into a box of our own devising. That's interesting, metaphoric and metaphysical and all these uses of meta. I got to look at more of the definitions of the prefix meta. Well, it says magical thinking does not have to mean anti-scientific gullibility or New Age hucksterism or the cognitive trump card of the densest sort of spiritual bypassing. Can you prove that the spirit guide I see just behind your right shoulder isn't there? Yeah, so that's, I think it's all these things are ripe for manipulation and illusion, not actually spirituality. I guess that's part of why it's so important that when you go see a practitioner that you're really checking to see is what you're hearing and receiving and the dance with that person, that being. Is it, energetically, does it align? Does it have you feel more alive and more connected in a way that includes all of you and all of your experience? Yeah. Well, you get an idea. So it's interesting. I realize now more of my own perspectives. I take this and I mix it in with so many of the things that are new that I've explored since I studied with Robert 10 years ago. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for listening. Again, this is Spiritual Bypassing, when spirituality disconnects us from what really matters, with commentary from me, Laureli Shimayo. You can learn more about me at laurelishimayo.com. That's LAURELISHIMAYO.com. And I hope you enjoy. If you are going to make it tonight, I'm doing oh goodness, I have it right here. Well, I'm doing a Me We Awakening panel on spiritual bypassing. It's going to be so interesting to have this conversation because the four of us, I think it is, that are on the panel have never talked about spiritual bypassing before. So we all bring different perspectives. This is going to be really interesting. We meet on Saturday, January 16 at 4 p.m. at joinmeweonline.com. That's JOINMEWEONLINE.com. See you there. Thanks for listening.